My parents told me to drop out and take a gap year because their precious daughter finally got into college after failing high school twice. They said they couldn't afford both of us. When I went to my grandparents for help, they revealed a college fund meant for us both, but now my parents swear they only knew about my sister's share. My younger sister, Vivi, just graduated high school. But let me tell you, it was not a straightforward journey for her. She failed high school not once, but twice before this third, final attempt. School was never her thing. She struggled academically, couldn't focus, and motivation was always a battle. At first, she'd blame it on dyslexia, but after multiple tests, that was ruled out. Once that excuse was gone, things spiraled. She started acting out, getting into trouble. There were countless times she was caught smoking weed with older kids, skipping classes to party. My parents were constantly at their wits' end. They tried talking, grounding, nothing worked. Vivi would sneak out, often in the middle of the night, to meet friends or random guys she'd found online. And where did all their frustration land? On me. They'd blame me for not being a good older sister, for not guiding her or showing her how to be better. It wasn't like I didn't care. I did. I wanted to help, but Vivi never listened. Every time I tried to talk her out of something reckless, she'd get defensive, angry. After a while, I just stopped. It was easier to keep the peace, even though I knew deep down it wasn't helping Vivi make better choices. One early morning, absolute chaos erupted. My mom, in her usual routine, went to check on us, but Vivi's room was empty. I was jolted awake by her screaming at me and Dad, demanding to know where Vivi was. Half asleep and confused, I rushed to her room, hoping for a note. Anything. Nothing. We called her, but her phone was off. Panic set in. We were literally seconds away from calling the police. No trace, no idea if she was safe. It was terrifying. Just as we were about to dial, one of our mutual friends messaged me. Privately, she confessed something shocking. Vivi had gone out again to meet a stranger from online. A date. A wave of dread washed over me. I told my parents. Thankfully, our friend knew the guy's address. Vivi had shared it with her. We raced over. My mom didn't hesitate. She barged right in, screaming Vivi's name. The look on Vivi's face? Pure shock and embarrassment. She couldn't believe we found her. Thankfully, nothing dangerous had happened. The guy seemed just as surprised as us. Vivi had lied about her age. My dad, absolutely furious, threatened the guy before practically dragging Vivi out. The car ride home was a nightmare. Shouting, accusations, Vivi being defiant. My mom trying to make her understand the gravity of her actions. Vivi was also furious with me for getting the address from our friend, telling me I should have just kept my mouth shut, that she could have snuck back later. She simply didn't grasp how serious her actions were, how worried we all were. When we finally got home, Vivi was grounded. I thought, this is it. Maybe she'll change. But that's not what happened. Instead, my parents became overly protective. They were so terrified of losing her that they started giving in to her demands, just to keep her safe and home. Vivi quickly figured out how much leverage she had. She knew that as long as they were afraid she'd run off or get into trouble, they'd give her what she wanted. And she exploited it. When Vivi failed high school the first time, I expected consequences. A serious talk, some discipline. Instead, my parents didn't even scold her. They told her they understood how hard high school was and encouraged her to try again, as if failing was no big deal. They thought they were being supportive, patient. To me, it felt like they were turning a blind eye, reinforcing her belief that she didn't have to take responsibility. Every mistake was excused. It was like they were rewarding bad behavior. The second time she repeated high school, things got worse. She was caught cheating on an exam and suspended. This was serious. Surely, this would be the moment they disciplined her. But no, they sympathized, saying the pressure was too much. This was Vivi's low point. She dropped out entirely. She was frustrated, defeated, seeing her friends move on while she was stuck. She started working at a bar. My parents tried to convince her to go back. They even urged me to talk to her. I spent hours encouraging her. I knew she couldn't live her whole life working at a bar. My parents had spoiled her enough. I had to push her to be better. Finally, after a lot of back and forth, Vivi agreed to try one last time. My parents paid enough to enroll her in another high school, despite her record. This time I kept a close eye, and I have to say, she worked hard. She passed her exams. I was so incredibly proud, I took her out to celebrate. Later, when I dropped her off, I was exhausted. I decided to stay the night in my old room. Driving back to my college apartment felt impossible. The next morning, I woke up to the delicious, familiar smell of cinnamon. My mom's cinnamon rolls are legendary. I knew she'd made them. Excited, I hurried downstairs. As I got closer, I heard my parents talking in low voices. When I walked into the kitchen, they both looked up, faces tense. Sensing the awkwardness, I asked what was going on. My mom quickly brushed it off, saying everything was fine, then changed the subject, insisting I stay for dinner. I had planned to head back to college, but she agreed, not thinking much of it. That evening, during dinner, my dad told Vivi and me how proud they were of us. My mom nodded along. Then they turned to Vivi and asked if she'd thought about college. She lit up, excitedly talking about her plans for Ivy League schools, wanted to join a prestigious college like mine. She was hopeful, optimistic. It was heartwarming to see her so excited. My parents listened, nodding. But then they turned to me. There was a moment of silence. The way they looked at me felt different, like something serious was coming. My dad spoke, his voice nervous. He started by saying that since Vivi would soon be heading to college, he and Mom had made a very difficult decision. He said they could no longer afford to pay for my college fees. I just sat there, stunned, not fully understanding. My mom chimed in, trying to soften the blow. She explained how they'd always wanted to remodel the house, but couldn't because they were so busy supporting me financially. Now, with Vivi about to start college, they'd be dipping into savings even further, risking their retirement. She pointed out that it was only fair for me to start paying for my education since I was an adult, and they couldn't fund both of us. My mind was racing. How was I supposed to afford my own college fees? I barely had enough savings to last a couple of months, even with my part-time job. The thought of taking out massive loans made my stomach drop. I had just 2 years left until graduation, and now I was being told I was on my own. I glanced at Vivi. She looked just as shocked and concerned. It didn't seem fair. She had just graduated after failing so many times, and while I was genuinely happy for her, the idea that I would now have to fend for myself while my parents continued to support her financially felt like a punch in the gut. I asked my parents if they planned to cover only 2 years of Vivi's college, like they had with me, and if she'd be expected to pay her way after that. They avoided eye contact. The silence that followed was my answer. My mother started saying Vivi was the youngest, she needed more attention, which is why they'd pay for her entire education, otherwise she might drop out altogether. She and my dad couldn't see how upset I was. To them, it made sense. Vivi needed help, I was old enough. But to me, it felt like they were abandoning me halfway through something they had committed to. I tried to argue, to make them see how unfair this was. I wasn't asking them to completely fund my life. I just wanted them to follow through with their commitment to me, just like they were going to do for Vivi. But they cut me off. My dad's tone grew frustrated. He said if I couldn't afford the fees, I could quit college, take a year off. He pointed out it wasn't a big deal. I could work double shifts, save up, and then return. The idea of delaying my graduation felt like a nightmare. It hurt to see how easily they were willing to make that sacrifice for Vivi, but not for me. Since that awful dinner, I was at a complete loss. Vivi was just as upset with our parents, but I urged her not to argue further. I told her if she pushed too hard, they might cut off her funding too, leaving her in the same position I was in. The last thing I wanted was for both of us to be stuck. A few days ago, Vivi, surprisingly, was the one who gave me an idea. Reach out to our maternal grandparents. They're quite well off, and growing up, we spent a lot of time with them. They lived in a different town, and though it had been a while, I decided to take the bus to see them. They felt like my last hope. When I arrived, my grandparents were pleasantly surprised. They were thrilled, their warm welcome making me feel a little more at ease, though the knot in my stomach remained. They had no idea why I was really there. After settling in, I finally mustered the courage to open up. I told them everything, how my parents decided to stop paying for my college, how I had no way to cover the costs. It was hard not to get emotional. I could see the concern on their faces as I spoke, but they listened patiently. Then, heart pounding, I asked if they could loan me some money for college. I emphasized it would be a loan, and I'd pay it all back. I was serious. I didn't want them to think I was just asking for a handout. Still, asking for help felt like crossing a line. But my grandparents seemed taken aback. They exchanged confused glances. My grandfather asked why I would need money when I already had a college fund. I stared back just as confused. What college fund? This is where my grandfather dropped a bombshell. He told me that both he and my grandmother had set up two separate college funds years ago. One for me, one for Vivi. After I turned 18, they gave both funds to my parents, trusting them to manage it and use it solely for our education. This, apparently, is how my parents have been paying for my college fees until now. My grandparents were under the impression that Vivi and I were taken care of. My grandfather simply said I just needed to ask my parents for the money set aside for me. I was speechless. I looked at my grandparents, incredulous, trying to process what they were telling me. My parents had never once mentioned anything about a college fund. Not to me, not to Vivi. For years, we thought they were paying out of their own savings. My mind was racing with questions. Why hadn't they told us? Where had the money gone? What were they using it for if not our education? I felt utterly angry and betrayed. All this time, they had let me believe I'd have to take out loans or drop out, while they had this money that could easily cover everything. It made no sense. Right there in my grandparents' house, I called my mother. I put her on speakerphone so my grandparents could hear everything. I wanted no misunderstandings. I wanted answers. When she answered, I asked her directly about my college fund that my grandparents supposedly gave her. There was a pause. I could tell she was caught off guard. Her hesitation only fueled my suspicion. She was scrambling. She asked who had put such wrong ideas in my head. That's when I told her it was my grandparents, who were sitting right there, who gave me the information after I'd come to ask for money. At this point, her tone grew sharp. She got furious that I had gone to meet them without talking to her. First, and for letting her parents overhear our conversation without her knowledge. She tried to explain, saying the money wasn't specifically for me, but rather for the entire family. But before she could continue, my grandfather, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. He firmly pointed out that when he gave them the money, he was very clear it was specifically for mine and Vivi's college education, not some general family fund. He asked her sternly where she was planning on using the money, if not for my remaining 2 years of college. My mother fell silent. She didn't know how to respond. She then said she needed to talk to my dad, as he handled their finances. The way she seemed flustered and evasive only made me more suspicious. It was as though she'd been caught in a lie, or, at the very least, something they'd been trying to hide. Later, she texted me, insisting I had no right to meet my grandparents behind her back. She accused me of being a jerk for letting her parents overhear and for trying to find out what happened to my college fund. As many of you suggested, my grandparents and I did confront my parents directly. When we arrived at their house, my grandfather didn't waste time. He immediately demanded answers about the college fund. He asked why they were suddenly refusing to pay for my college when the money for my education was a gift from him and Grandma. My father tried to explain something about the money not being enough, but my grandfather came prepared. Without hesitation, he pulled out a stack of financial statements, showing exactly how much money he'd saved up for my education and given to my parents. Let me tell you, it was a lot. More than enough for all 4 years of my college, and then some. I couldn't hold back anymore. I confronted them, asking why they had never once mentioned this fund to me. I pointed out how stressed I'd been for days, trying to figure things out. How could they knowingly let me struggle like that without ever telling me the truth? That's when my mom finally broke down. She confessed, guilt clear in her voice, that over the years, they had slowly started dipping into my college fund. First, they'd used a significant portion to take care of Vivi. It turned out that all those times Vivi failed high school and my parents paid for private school fees or expensive tutors, they had been using my college fund to do it. I'd always assumed they were using their own savings, making sacrifices. But in reality, it was my future they were draining to prop her up. My mom also confessed they'd used the money for several vacations she and Dad had taken. My parents admitted that Vivi's new phone, her new car, yes, the one she was driving around, had all been bought with my college fund. As a result, along with the fees they'd paid for my first 2 years of college, my fund was completely exhausted. Vivi's college fund, however, remained untouched. I pointed out that it only seemed fair then if they paid my remaining semesters using her fund, since they'd used my money on her. At this point, my dad chimed in, trying to dissuade me. He told me I was his more mature kid, the grown-up child who always managed to figure things out on her own. He urged me not to touch Vivi's college fund, saying if I did, her fund would get exhausted too, and then she might struggle. He told me Vivi had always needed more help than I did, and as her big sister, I shouldn't be asking for her money. It was as if he expected me to understand, even agree. The implication was clear. My parents believed my sacrifices were justified because, in their eyes, I was strong enough to handle the consequences, while Vivi, always more dependent, wasn't. Hearing their words was like a punch to the gut. My grandparents were absolutely furious. My grandmother outright stated she would fully support me if I wanted to sue my parents for wrongfully misusing the fund meant for my future. There was no sympathy in her voice as she pointed out what my parents had done wasn't just morally wrong, but legally questionable too. My parents, clearly panicking now, tried to argue and justify their behavior, fumbling for excuses about doing what was best for the family. But by now, their words held no weight. My grandfather had heard enough. He reminded my parents, in no uncertain terms, that 2 years ago, he had generously gifted them the family house they now lived in. He had done this so they could focus on raising a family without the burden of buying a home. It was a gesture of love and support. He had never asked for rent, never threatened to take the house away. But now, seeing how selfishly they had taken my college education money, using it not only on themselves but also on Vivi's high school fees, tutors, her car, her phones, it was too much to bear. He could no longer trust them. My grandfather declared they needed to be taught a lesson. He told them he would meet with a lawyer and transfer the deed of the house from his name to mine. In doing so, I would become the rightful owner. He added without hesitation that if I wanted to, I could then just kick them out of the house entirely. Alternatively, if they wished to continue living there, they would have to start paying me rent. And with that rent, I could cover the college expenses they had forced me to shoulder on my own. My parents were speechless. I could barely contain the satisfaction bubbling up inside me. For the first time in this entire ordeal, my parents, who had secretly spent years making selfish decisions and prioritizing themselves and Vivi at my expense, were finally going to get a taste of their own medicine. Ever since then, my parents have been pleading with my grandfather to forgive them. My dad has even offered to use his own savings and sell Vivi's car, if necessary, to cover my college expenses. However, my grandfather remains firm in his decision. For everyone wondering where my sister was during that intense confrontation, I didn't mention it before, but my darling sister was off celebrating with her friends at a lake house. Apparently, she was footing the bill for this getaway, a gift from my parents for finally managing to pass high school. When I confronted my parents about it, their response was almost laughable. Vivi needed to relax after all the stress of high school. Can you imagine the audacity? Here I was, practically begging and fighting tooth and nail just to get them to cover my college expenses, the ones that should have already been covered by my college fund, while they had no issue at all funding a luxurious celebration for the youngest. The double standards are infuriating, to say the least. I come here bearing happy news. True to his word, my grandfather followed through, and the house deed has officially been transferred to me. I am now the rightful owner of our family home. The sense of empowerment I feel is unlike anything I've experienced before. For so long, I've felt powerless in the face of my parents' decisions, but now the control is firmly in my own hands. Naturally, my parents are furious with me. They expected to remain in the house without consequences, but those days are over. Despite their anger, I stood my ground and made it clear that they had two options. Either they could vacate the house within a month, or they could stay but prepare to pay me rent starting next month. There was no room for negotiation. It's almost ironic. After everything they've put me through, now they're the ones facing a tough choice. Of course, my sister Vivi has found out about everything by now. A lot of you keep asking me in the comments, and I want to be clear. She wasn't ever involved in what our parents did, or even had any idea about our college funds, despite the fact that so much of the money had been spent on her education and luxuries. She wasn't the one making the decisions. In fact, she's been incredibly supportive of me throughout this ordeal. When she learned the full extent of our parents' actions, she was just as furious as I was. She's angry at them for how they mishandled the college fund and betrayed not just me, but the trust our grandparents had placed in them.